Good afternoon, everyone. This is Terry Behrens. Welcome to our Foundation Review webinar on the future of community. All right, I'm the editor of the Foundation Review and director of the Institute for Foundation and Donor Learning at the Johnson Center, and I will be the moderator for today's webinar. We are very pleased to be able to present this in partnership with the Council on Foundations. Through their sponsorship, the entire issue is available free online, and we will point you to where to find that momentarily. And Council members, as well as TFR subscribers, were eligible to enroll in this webinar for free. Before we move on, in case you have any technical trouble during the course of the webinar, you might want to jot down the phone number and email here, and they can help you with getting connected if you have any issues. Typically that goes very smoothly, but just in case. We'll just go over the agenda, and we have a couple of housekeeping items. And then we'll do introductions. We'll then go into our presentation. We have two of the authors from our special issue presenting their work with us today, and then we will open up for Q&A at the end. So all the phone lines are muted. We have quite a few folks on the webinar, and it keeps the noise down. Please use the chat function to communicate with me, with the presenters. If you move your cursor to the bottom left of the screen, you'll see a little button there that you can click on, and a chat window will open up. It says move to the top of the screen here, but ReadyTalk just changed it up on us, so it's now at the bottom left corner. So you can do that at any time during the course of the webinar, and I will be posing the questions to our presenters at the end. Questions for clarification we may do in the interim, but we will save the discussion for the end. The webinar is being recorded, and all of the registered participants will get a link to that recording as well as a copy of the slides. This webinar is based on our special issue that, as I mentioned earlier, that we did in collaboration with the Council on Foundations. The special issue really built on the Council on Foundations conference theme for last year on the future of community, and this issue gave us a chance to dig in a little deeper to some of the topics that were discussed at the conference. So today we have two of the articles being presented. Laurel Carlton, who is the Director of Leadership Initiatives and Governance at the Community Foundations of Canada, will be sharing her work with us. Laurel brings a range of experiences to the Community Foundations of Canada, including a background in language education, research, translation, program and project management, as well as policy analysis. She has worked in Alberta, New Brunswick, Spain, and Guatemala. Laurel has a BA in International Relations from Mount Allison University and an MPA from Carleton University. Deborah Markley is co-founder and managing director of the Center for Rural Entrepreneurship, a national nonprofit. Deb brings over 30 years of experience in community economic development. Before founding the center, she held academic positions as well as operating her own consulting practice. Her research, which is very field-based, has been presented in academic journals as well as to national public policy organizations and even congressional committees. Deb has a BA and an MS in agricultural economics from Cornell University and a PhD in agricultural economics from Virginia Tech. Before I turn the microphone over to Laurel to get us started, we want to get a little bit of an idea of who is on the webinar today. So if you could take a moment and just click on the button that best represents the organization that you represent. That will give us a feel for who's with us today. Okay, community foundations, very well represented in our audience today, so about almost 2/3, as well as a good representation of family foundations and then universities. Laurel, with their community foundation hat on. This is an audience that's just prime for you. Okay, so Laurel, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you. I'm hoping folks can hear me. This is a new platform for me, and so bear with me as we go. But really thankful to be here today, and I should mention right off the top that this paper, Knowledge as Leadership, Belonging as Community, How Canadian Community Foundations Are Using Vital Science for Social Change, this is really a collaborative effort, and so looking forward to sharing our learnings today. But also will note that my colleagues Ian, Lee, and Dr. Phillips have all played a really important role in informing this research. So happy to answer questions as I can, and also to pass interested folks on to others who can fill in further. Now, some interesting things about the Community Foundations of Canada, and I suppose I'm thinking that we really should have started with a poll to get a sense of how many folks here are on the line are in the States and how many are in Canada, because there's some interesting context here. The Community Foundations of Canada is a little bit of a unique organization in that we're the peak body for Canada's 191 community foundations. And unlike many networks of community foundations in other countries, Community Foundations of Canada is actually uniquely focused on community foundations. We're not also joined by our colleagues in the private philanthropic sector, and so that means that we kind of have this unique relationship with the 191, as we call them. And so together, there are 191 community foundations in Canada, and another piece that's kind of unique about our outlook is that these community foundations actually serve, it's an estimated 85% of Canadians. It's a heavily, as Canada is compared to the United States, a fairly rural country. The vast majority of our membership are actually in very small communities. And so it's an interesting act in terms of balancing a movement that includes the Toronto Foundation and the Vancouver Foundation, in cities that have 2 million plus people, but also, the Winkler Foundation in Manitoba and the Clayoquot Sound Foundation in British Columbia, or the Minnedosa Foundation, which serves 300 people. So it's a diverse network, and today we're looking forward to sharing some of our learnings. So I guess one of the things I'd like to start off with is just a quick question that we often explore with our members when we explore the various roles that a community foundation can play. And here we go with this platform. Have I succeeded at moving the slide? There we are. So if we were to imagine that a foundation can't even grant $1 next year, what other assets could that foundation mobilize for impact? And so I'll give you a moment to respond here which ones you think apply, as well as really curious to know, for those of you that will be selecting other, what other assets might be out there for a foundation to consider? All right, so it looks like we've got great responses across the board, and what's really interesting, if this was a discussion format, I'd be really curious to know the thinking behind various answers. Certainly you can feel free to select all that you feel that apply. But what we've been learning with the movement, and what we'll explore a bit today, is that information about an issue, grant-making data, a community foundation's perspective, relationships, all four of those can actually be considered as forms of community knowledge. And loving here in the box, seeing convening power, absolutely, leadership, connections. There's many elements here, but certainly when we do this exercise with the community foundations, it's a really interesting stepping stone towards that conversation about what is the role of a foundation beyond exclusively issuing grants. So just a quick overview of what we'll be exploring in the first part of this webinar. So first we'll be exploring knowledge as an asset, as a concept, and particularly a quick discussion about community knowledge as well. we'll then be kind of considering what the community foundations themselves, or CFs as we call them, how they use community knowledge in Canada for local leadership. And then particularly from Community Foundations of Canada's perspective, how the interplay for a peak body or a national leadership organization in terms of navigating the balance between community knowledge and then activating that for national leadership. And we'll be then kind of doing a brief deep dive into an initiative that we're currently running now called the Community Fund for Canada's 150th. And while this is the overview, the overarching themes here will really be about exploring what we have been learning when we from treating knowledge and community knowledge in particular as an asset. What kind of changes that we've had to make at CFC as the national peak body when we do value community knowledge as an asset, and a brief exploration of actually the challenges that we've faced also in doing that. So if we first look at knowledge as an asset, knowledge writ large could include information, facts, and data, the what about something, and certainly that's quite a broad definition, and I think when we get into community knowledge it'll become evident that we really are looking at it in this broad way. The things that people know about something, and that could be informed certainly by government statistics, the census, local data that's gathered, but it also might be informed by relationships, perspectives, the positionality of the individual holding that knowledge. And this is really important and something that we've certainly been learning about as a national network of 191 local organizations, that one's relationship to a knowledge source can certainly bear strong bearing on the way that that knowledge is interpreted or experienced. Certainly one's relationship with power dynamics or a socioeconomic status or ethno-linguistic experiences can certainly all play into that. And then that positionality, exactly the relationship that one has to an issue or one's own experience can certainly further inform that knowledge. And one thing that we've certainly, to give an example, in Canada we have been rapidly grappling with the fact that since 2008 and with a national report released last year, as a country we've been learning a significantly important piece about our own history and the role that we've been playing with the Indigenous people that live in the Canadian territory through something called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And so actually many Canadians are going through a process of relearning the true history of our country. And so, that's a macro example, but it's also a vital one when we think about knowledge and community knowledge as an asset. That piece about what do we know, where do we learn it from, and what's our relationship with it has really played an important role in the work that we engage in. And then, of course, we've got some notes here on the fact that, as we are transforming knowledge into an asset, it really does need to be interpreted and used. Certainly, when we're working with the community foundations, there's lots of learning about the amount of data available at the local level as well as the national level, but without an interpretation, without bringing all these points we've discussed, relationships, perspective, and positionality to the table, and without catalyzing it for a reason, that it certainly remains information but doesn't actually transform into this asset. I'm going to just pause for a sec though, and Deb, who's my colleague on the line, I don't know, Deb, do you have any reflections on this knowledge as an asset that you'd like to add?
Thanks, Laurel. I was thinking about one experience that we've had recently about this whole issue of perceptions and misperceptions and how communities actually use the information that they have about their community. And just wanted to share one really quick anecdote, if you will, of some work that we were doing with a foundation that was having some community conversations that they were facilitating. It was an area of high poverty, above the state average, above the region even. And we had an early conversation about poverty that was really focused about how do you get people to work and just a negative perception about people in poverty. And as we shared some additional information about the percent of the population that was actually working, which was well above 80%, you could see people's perceptions begin to shift within that conversation, and the conversation stopped being about why people were not working hard enough when they were poor to how do we get good jobs, how do we help people do better in the jobs that they have so they can move out of poverty. And so I think this whole idea of knowledge as an asset and being able to use information within the community to both challenge and also support the perceptions that we have is so critical. Thanks for letting me chime in.
No, absolutely. I think that's a great anecdote. And I mentioned the learnings that we've been going through as a country, really. And certainly I think there's a lot of what your example is bringing to mind is the fact, too, that when many of the communities that we work with have a lot of preconceived notions or ideas about not only the First Nations, the Indigenous people that live in their community, but actually there's also a lot of misinformation at a national and local level about tax incentives and free education and free gasoline, and there's a lot of misinformation around. And what's been really interesting is watching over the past couple of years the transformation in a lot of communities as they understand not only what are the actual policies in place around some of this, but also the real history of what's been going on in Canada for the last 150, 200 years. And it's a great transition to watch and to appreciate that when knowledge is unlocked as an asset, it can be a powerful tool for changing the dialogue and changing perspectives. So one of the interesting things that we've been learning about at Community Foundations of Canada is also the power of community knowledge and community knowledge as an asset. So the data, facts, and information that community members hold about their own local community. And certainly this might come from non-traditional knowledge sources, statistics measured from an after-school program, a city's transit schedule, the demographic makeup of a neighborhood, the number of types of books that are checked out at a local library, a municipal database, or even the results of a citizen-led neighborhood revitalization project. And I mention these because certainly in our work we've seen that many of the community foundations often don't initially consider this type of knowledge to be considered as formal knowledge. It might be information that's available in the public domain, or it might be actually information that individual community members hold. But it's certainly a particular asset for community foundations for a couple of reasons. One is that in Canada, because so many of the communities are very rural and isolated, community knowledge is often the only source of data on a community. So while we do a national census, if you live in Leroy, BC, or Minnedosa, Manitoba, there actually might not be data that applies to a community as small as yours. Another piece is that you might be part of a region that has drastic differences from community to community, and so the information that might be available at a national level might actually just not apply. And so some really interesting learnings have come out of what we've learned when we acknowledge community knowledge as an asset. One example is there was a community conversation held in a community called Revelstoke, and they learned there was a conversation about transportation and the importance of that in the community. And community members actually came forward with their own understanding, based on living in the community, about the local bus schedule. And there was a really interesting learning about the fact that actually if you wanted to get from that community to a hospital, the bus schedule actually didn't allow you to get there in one day and come all the way back. And so what was interesting is the Community Foundation was then able to mobilize and lead conversations with the local government and officials involved in the transportation sector to change the transportation schedule, but it was only made possible by the fact that local community members and their knowledge and experience with the local bus line were able to come forward, and their experiences were valued as a knowledge and an asset. Now, this is a pretty simple poll. But I'm just curious to know here, out of those on the line, the kinds of knowledge that I've just talked about, this real grassroots understanding of what's going on in a community. Is that something that your organization currently considers as valid? This is looking like overwhelming, like a pretty strong support for the fact that many are using that knowledge as for impact, which is wonderful to hear, because certainly here in Canada there's been many voices who have continued to ask questions about the validity of local data, and certainly that's to be balanced with other sources. But another example is that there's a community in Alberta that has a significant amount of formal data about the housing market, but through a community conversation it was learned that that actually, even though the housing market is considered to be in quite an affordable space, the housing that is currently available is mostly in bunk beds that are listed on a website called Kijiji or Craigslist. I'm not sure what you might have in your various regions, but a bunk bed in a 4-bedroom room is actually going for $750 a month right now, which is not information that would have been available through perhaps the traditional knowledge venues, but it's certainly been transformative for that community to have a greater understanding of what's really going on. Well, so community foundations in Canada have been using community knowledge to have impact. One of the ways is through sharing information and raising awareness, and one of the ways that we do that is through something called the Vital Signs program, which is a community check-in that individual community foundations a community checkup, can host on an annual or biannual basis. And it involves hosting community conversations, gathering local data, interpreting it, and then using it for a variety of means. So one of them might be sharing information and raising awareness. Another, like many mentioned in that earlier conversation about assets that a foundation holds, many community foundations are convening relationships with community members, particularly those that might not otherwise be connected. Many of the community foundations, and this is an ongoing challenge, is that that use of community knowledge to then ensure that many perspectives are included. And certainly when we get into this a little bit more, there have been many community foundations that have actually come to us with questions about how to do that more effectively, sharing that although they're aware through the community knowledge that challenges exist, that certain voices aren't at the table, but that engagement continues to be a challenge. And then of course community foundations can then activate that knowledge for knowledge-driven grant making. And there's some really interesting examples of how some community foundations have been doing this, one of them being the Grassroots Grants Program in Calgary, another being the Neighborhood Small Grants Program in Vancouver, both of which are touched on in our article. But essentially these are communities that have really heard loud and clear from their community conversations that belonging and participation are crucially low in their communities. And so interestingly, both foundations have taken to a small granting approach where they take a specific lens to things like building inclusion in vertical communities. How are people connecting when they live in a built-up urban environment and don't know their neighbors? What kind of projects can be activated at this really grassroots level? And that's something that only emerged through these community conversations and local knowledge. Now, the real question here that we've been learning from is this community knowledge and national leadership. What does it mean for CFC as a peak body when we treat community knowledge as an asset? How can we unlock the potential of the community foundation movement, and what learnings have we had from that? So one of the pieces is actually that when we treat community knowledge as an asset, Vital Signs becomes so much more than a tool for local community foundations. It can become a national tool to drive conversation. And so in the past couple years, as we've been seeing belonging become such a theme of so many Vital Signs reports from individual community foundations, CFC actually mobilized a national vital signs report on belonging, involving heavily voices from the individual community foundations. The other interesting piece there is that when we treat community knowledge as an asset, it's vitally important as a national peak body that we create enough space for the community foundations to each bring their own community knowledge and to bring their own individual perspectives, so that when we activate initiatives as an entire movement, that it's done in a way that really allows for those community foundations to bring that knowledge forward. Also, when we treat knowledge as a asset, it's fundamentally changed the way that we look at relationships and convening other collaborators. As an example, very operationally, we've made a commitment to working with others in a shared space so that we can have the benefit of that knowledge of others through relationships. So in our office right now, next to me, we've got the Circle on Philanthropy and Aboriginal Peoples in Canada. And that relationship certainly brings a wealth of knowledge and understanding to our work that we wouldn't otherwise have. Operationally, we also share space with Hub Ottawa, which is an innovation hub, a very different kind of perspective, but that relationship really helps inform our work while we balance it with local community knowledge. Another operational thing that we've had to really grapple with as a national peak body is that when we see community knowledge as an asset, we've had to do really intentional work around including many perspectives at the table. So for example, on our board of directors, there's now a commitment to including a wide range of voices, including Canadians from all parts of the country, rural and urban, as well as ensuring that there's representation from Indigenous people on the board, new Canadians as well, ensuring that there's actually strong representation from both of our official language groups. So in Canada, that there be Francophones and Anglophones on the board so that we can have that conversation in both official languages. And it extends beyond our board, but when we treat knowledge as an asset, this inclusion of many perspectives is something we're having to bring to all of our work. And then lastly, we take on a series of kind of national initiatives that community foundations are invited to participate. And now that we see community knowledge as an asset, it's actually fundamentally shifted the way that we design those kinds of initiatives. So we'll get into the first one more in a second. So the Community Fund for Canada's 150th is a national small grants program that's a matching program between the Government of Canada and individual community foundations. And we've had to be very careful about the way that we design that program such that it leaves real space for local leadership and the activation of that local knowledge while still maintaining a national arc. Earlier this year, we also held an initiative called the Welcome Fund for Syrian Refugees, which involved the disbursement of just over $5 million through communities across Canada to support the settlement of Syrian refugees in Canada. And my colleagues who worked on that program because community knowledge is such an asset, had to play a very careful role in creating space for the community foundations to build their own local relationships, to tell us, in Peterborough, it needs to work in partnership with these groups, but that's not going to be what's needed or as effective as 3,000 kilometers away in a community of a completely different size and shape. So all of these ways are, as we continue to see community knowledge as an asset, it really has driven a transformation in CFC as this peak body. And here, this is just a snapshot of our movement to give you a sense really of when we're talking about having to accommodate and create space for that community knowledge to emerge. We truly are talking from the highest north there is a community foundation in a city called Yellowknife, the farthest south in Windsor next to Detroit, and everywhere in between from east to west. There's such a wide variety of lived experiences in our movement, from community foundations that only speak French to community foundations that only speak English, and groups that are from large and small communities, as well as really different socioeconomic makeups, that it's quite a challenge to factor all of those elements in. The one really concrete example of our efforts to do that is the Community Fund for Canada's 150th, which is mentioned in our article. As I alluded to, this is a small grants program that was seeded with $10 million from the Government of Canada and is being matched by individual community foundations in all parts of Canada. And one of the really interesting things here is that when we first started having this conversation, it was really grounded in the fact that the community foundation movement collectively holds this asset of local knowledge. And while that appears different in each of the communities, if there's the possibility to activate a national narrative, we can both achieve a nation-building exercise as a country while also creating space for local leadership and truly impactful projects to arise at the local level. Now, before I get into some examples, one thing that often comes up when I talk about this initiative is there's some questions that come up immediately about the theme. Okay, so Canada's 150th, is this a small grants program that provides funding to cake and fireworks celebrations? And that, what's been interesting on our journey is that as we stay committed to community knowledge as an asset, what's emerged is that, well, some communities have actually come forward and said, in our community, the thing that will be most valuable actually is a convening exercise, whether that's a celebration or some kind of opportunity to come together, because there's only 300 people in our community. We really don't often have that opportunity, so that will be impactful for us. But as we've stayed committed to this community knowledge as an asset concept, it's also created space for others to come forward and say, well, in our community, inclusion of seniors and intergenerational understanding is a real challenge. And others have come forward and shared that increasing reconciliation between the Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in their community is a real priority, and that would make this impactful for them. And so with that in mind, what has emerged is this national granting program that has three core pillars that all of the projects will work towards building vibrant and healthy communities, or increasing understanding and knowledge between community members about their own community, or that those projects will encourage participation in community initiatives, all with the guise of increasing inclusion, connection, belonging, and understanding at the community level. So we've just got some interesting and concrete examples of exactly what that's looked like within that broad frame. So when we create space for community knowledge to be an asset and to emerge as local leadership, in Vancouver we see that a lot of the grants will target urban isolation and vertical communities, whereas in Montreal, urban isolation and homelessness, as well as women and particularly issues concerning domestic violence, are what has been identified as the key areas of need in that community. In Lethbridge, reconciliation and diversity, just as in Peterborough. And we've got this community in Big Grass, Manitoba that is grappling with the fact that they have an aging population and a very small youth demographic that often doesn't connect between themselves. In Burlington, we see youth engagement and mental health as a priority, whereas in Ottawa and St. John's, we see very different priorities around youth engagement. And so, it's just a very interesting example here of both the power of community knowledge as an asset, but also what it means for a national peak body to work to unlock that for national initiatives that need to balance a national leadership vision with also the space for local community foundations to lead and to activate their individual community knowledge. Now, none of this comes without challenges, and certainly we've been learning, as I'd mentioned already, we've been learning a lot about the positionality and the perspective and the subjectivity of knowledge and the role that power relationships can play at the community level, as well as the readiness and willing or openness of individual community foundations to actually consider a wide range of knowledge in their communities. We've also been learning a lot about individual community foundations and their knowledge of us as a national peak body. But nonetheless, we've been experiencing that community knowledge is a powerful asset, and I look forward to learning more through your questions at the end.
Okay, thank you, Laurel. Just want to remind people that feel free to send in your questions via chat at any time. And if you have any questions of clarification right now, I'm not seeing any, we could pose those. But it looks like we are probably ready to go on and turn it over to Deb Markley.
Thank you. Thanks, Terry. And happy to be with all of you this afternoon. I want to start, as Laurel did, by acknowledging that I'm not the only author on this paper. This is a reflective practice piece that was done by the center, my colleague Don Mackey and I, as well as our partners at the Aspen Institute Community Strategies Group, Janet Topolsky, Travis Green, and Kristen Feirobin. And this also was part of our impetus, if you will, to submit this article was the pre-conference workshop that the Council on Foundations asked us to put together for the conference last spring that was about advancing community economic success. And so this article and that, the design and the content of that really practice-driven workshop all contributed to the content that I'm going to share with you this afternoon. I do want to also say that this was a reflective practice piece. So what I'm going to share with you is coming from what I hate to admit are decades of experience that Don and I and Janet Topolsky in particular bring to this field. We've been working in the field of community philanthropy with foundations for a long time now, and the insights that I'm going to share with you that we share in the article really are coming from our reflection of what we're seeing happening in the field and our attempt to make some sense of it and to begin to try to move from what we describe as some energy in the field to a broader movement. So I just wanted to give that kind of background as we start. So let's start with a poll. I'd just really be interested in if you are, many of you are from foundations, but how you would describe your engagement with economic development right now. Proactive responses, if you could just check that, it would be great. And if you're not from a foundation but have a foundation that you consider your foundation, how actively involved are they in economic development? So we'll give you just a minute to give those responses, and then I'll share the results here. Still seeing a few come in. I'm going to skip to the results in just a second. Okay. Well, I think it's fair to say that you're not alone in having about 50% of you just not quite sure what role to play or not engaged in economic development. Again, we see a lot of energy around this, but we still think that it's the kind of tip of the iceberg of community foundations out there that are leading the way. And part of what we're attempting to do as we talk about economic development philanthropy is to move more foundations into that direction. So let me jump in here. One of the grounding ideas here, at least, is why economic development should be a domain for philanthropy. And again, we see some foundations really moving into this space, and we see them being driven toward economic development because of some sense that economic development isn't producing the kinds of outcomes that we as community folks want to see, particularly community foundations want to see. It's not producing the kind of broadly shared outcomes. If you're here in the U.S., it's been a theme over the last year in this election cycle. But this also, this disparity, growing disparity and inequality that we're dealing with as the result of an economy that really isn't producing gains for everybody. And also what's driving folks, particularly in foundations, is this notion that if we're going to get different outcomes, we're going to have to start to recognize that we're going to have to do economic development differently than we have in the past. If we're doing it the same way, we're going to end up getting the same kinds of outcomes. So how do we really begin to retool the system, to take a different approach to economic development? And we're seeing more foundations recognizing that they have a pretty unique set of tools. Some of the things that you talked about in Laurel's poll, they have relationships. They have a broader perspective on what it means to advance an economy, what it means to build a prosperous region. And so we see this as a ripe field, if you will, an emerging domain for place-rooted foundations. And as we kind of reflect on what foundations bring to the table in terms of economic development, we see them having this broader mission that's focused on prosperity for everybody. In many cases, it's part of your mission statements to have an economy that works for all or prosperity for all. And that's not always the perspective that more traditional economic development players bring to the table. Foundations, place-rooted foundations, are also bringing a much longer time horizon to this work. And economic development is long-term work. If we're really going to talk about system change and doing economic development differently, it's not going to happen overnight. And a foundation that is for good forever really has a much longer time horizon than an elected official who's engaged in economic development or someone who's working for an elected official and is looking more in a more typical election cycle. We also see foundations getting involved in this because they bring a much more regional perspective and have a set of relationships across a broader region than simply an individual community. And often economic development has to be done from a regional perspective. We had some interesting experiences with a group of economic development professionals a few years ago where we're looking at the kinds of outcomes that they were achieving and asked the question of how are low-income people benefiting? And a couple of folks in this group of again, these were economic developers from communities of a range of different sizes, and we had many people say to us, gosh, we hadn't thought about low-income folks, and that's something that most foundations are bringing to the table. They've got a broader perspective on how an economy has to work to bring up the folks on the economic margins. And as Laurel really effectively pointed out, foundations just have a broader toolkit to bring to the table and as they address economic development. And they have these relationships. They're networked with many of the actors. And in the paper, we actually think about this role as the role of a social entrepreneur or a system actor, if you're familiar with that language from the Stanford Social Innovation Review. They're really thinking about how you bring all your resources together to begin to move a system in a different direction. So as we've observed from our work with foundations, when we see a foundation that's actually doing what we would say is practicing economic development philanthropy, what we tend to see are those foundations doing what we would describe as playing integrating or missing roles. This is not about a foundation taking over the job of economic development, but really understanding who's engaged in this landscape, who's actively involved in economic development, and what isn't getting done. What role is there for us to fill? What gap can we fill as a foundation with our unique set of assets that other people aren't doing? And I'll give some examples in just a minute. Part of the getting to those gaps is really understanding the landscape, being able to map that landscape. And this is where I think that knowledge asset comes into play so well, really understanding who else is working on the issues, building those relationships so that you can begin to see how work aligns, and then where the empty spaces are between the actors in a particular geographic place. And as I said before, they have this broader toolkit that can be mobilized in support of economic development and target then their actions to filling those gaps that can get to that economic prosperity, community prosperity that is the goal for so many foundations. And just a few examples of where we see foundations kind of playing that missing gap. The One Foundation, which is a family foundation in West Virginia, recognized that there was money that wasn't moving from community development financial institutions and other development organizations for lack of a loan loss reserve. And so they used their grant making. They actually made a grant to create a loan loss reserve so that economic development entities that were doing lending could take a little bit more risk and could begin to do some lending on the margins to folks that may not have qualified before. So again, not taking on that role but filling a very particular gap. In Michigan, Michigan, excuse me, I was thinking Minnesota there. In Michigan, one of the examples we use in the paper is Pennies from Heaven Foundation that created an employer resource network that was really designed to help create a win-win situation for both employers and employees by bringing more services to lower-income employees to make them more economically successful and therefore better employees, giving them access to transportation, daycare, making sure they had the full range of services they needed to be able to show up and be productive and also take care of their family and their responsibilities. So again, a gap that made economic development work better. And the final role, sometimes a foundation is called upon to really step into a gap of economic development that's pretty broad and gaping. And Encourage Foundation, as well as a number of the, in Wisconsin, as well as a number of the initiative foundations in Minnesota, have stepped firmly into this space, with West Central Initiative being, Initiative Foundation in Minnesota being the first foundation to also be an economic development entity. And Encourage really stepping into a gap to take on the role of economic development. So the gap there was pretty wide, and they were able to step in and fill it. So when we think about economic development and what that full range of assets is, here's a way that we like to think about it that we've put into the article. Obviously, there's financial assets that the foundation is bringing to the table, and of course grant making comes to mind, endowment building comes to mind, but there's also this much broader set of opportunities related to impact investing, and we did have impact investing raised as one of the other assets in response to Laurel's earlier question. We've also got that whole set of social assets, the networks, the relationships that we talked about before, that are particularly can be across sectors, public sector, private sector, across class, being able to engage low-income residents, new immigrant communities. So the foundation brings a broader set of assets along the social continuum than most economic development entities might. Political advocacy and influence about how to do economic development so that it generates a broader set of outcomes. And I want to just acknowledge again, we had this knowledge asset in there before we looked at Laurel's paper, but this is a particularly critical one, I think, when you think about economic development, because foundations, as they hone their skills in resident engagement, really understanding how the system is working, where the leverage points are, they're bringing a level of community knowledge to the economic development conversation that is often missing. Economic development is often viewed as something that the professionals should do, but we've had economic developers say to us, economic development isn't just the role for economic developers, it's a community responsibility. And when you see a foundation stepping into this space, they can bring this community knowledge that Laurel talked about through their resident engagement to the table to help direct the way that economic development works for everybody. And then again, the values that a foundation brings of just being in that space and bringing people together, particularly folks who might not be part of an economic development conversation, new immigrant communities where a foundation can actually provide them some voice and access to the decision-making process. I pulled this quote from the article that Laurel contributed to because I think it speaks so well to the importance of this knowledge asset with economic development philanthropy. So I just wanted to pay tribute to that because I think it is the key, and we'll see this as I share our framework, it is the key to making sure that the foundation is moving into economic development into that space where they can really make the most difference and can really drive impact toward this broad-based prosperity that we seek. So what we did based on the work that we've done with foundations, and I have to say we've done work with small foundations and larger foundations all across the country over the last several decades now. But as we thought about and worked with foundations and brought foundations together in a couple of peer learning opportunities related to this subject, we recognize that getting into this space takes some culture change, and that in order to help foundations better think through their readiness to actually step into a role in economic development, that some sort of framework, some way of thinking about getting started was important. And so this is a framework that you can see in much more detail. There's a whole set of questions under each of these elements, but you can see that in the paper. But what this framework does is helps the foundation sort of think through, do we actually have a commitment on the part of our board and staff and the community itself that we should play a role, that economic development is part of our mission statement, it's one of our goals, it's one of the things that we feel that we have, that we're mission-driven, if you will, to advance. And once that decision is made, how do we really understand our local community, our local economy, so that we can begin to identify, we can have enough information and enough knowledge of the system to be able to say, here's where there are gaps in the system, here's where there's an opportunity with our investment and our engagement that we could advance that. And so being able to move from a commitment to really building deep knowledge and understanding of the system, how it's working now, where the gaps are, and then being able to reflect back to the assets that a community foundation or a place-rooted foundation has to say, where are we uniquely qualified with our assets to step in and to make a difference? And then how do we actually do that, track our progress, figure out if we've had any impact, and then begin to go back and learn from that experience. And so it's a way, and we've used this after we developed the framework. We've laid it over some foundations in strategic conversations with them, and foundations have been able to see where they've made some progress and to see the other steps they need to take if they're really going to get into this this field of economic development philanthropy and do it well. So what's it take to do this? And so what we tried to do here is just to reflect on how a foundation that is more traditional, not necessarily applying their assets to economic development, but these are things that most foundations do. They exercise community leadership, they do resident community engagement. And on the right-hand side, what would that look like if you were putting that economic development focus or lens on top of it? And so as we think about community leadership, we're thinking about an organization like Encourage in Wisconsin that has really stepped in and said, our concern and our mission is to have an economy that works for everybody. And we're going to take on that mission, and our leadership is all going to be focused on helping to create an economy in our place that works for everybody. And so, again, it's community leadership, but it's community leadership really solidly in this economic development space. Foundations are good at bringing it together data, pushing it back out about the community. So what would that look like with an economic development focus? Again, I want to use a specific example. The Greater Kanawha Valley Foundation in West Virginia went through a strategic planning and engagement process that really helped to sharpen the focus of the foundation around wealth building. Everything they wanted to do needed to advance 7 forms of capital or assets in that place. And they did their own analysis. They took that analysis out into the community to really begin to say, what is it we could do? What are the best things we could do? Where should we put our focus in order to build this kind of wealth? And really did both their own internal kind of organizational development and commitment building around wealth creation, and then took it out into the community to also test their analysis of the system and where they needed to act, and to verify it and be able to bring it in to drive their strategy going forward. Foundations do resident and community engagement. What does that look like when you're talking about economic development? And I'll take you to New Hampshire and the Tillotson Fund of the New Hampshire Charitable Foundation. They are engaged in a process right now of bringing together people around economic sectors. They've made a commitment to move some sectors forward, economic sectors forward in their region, and they're doing a really intensive mapping and engagement process with people around those sectors so that they can begin to think about where their investments could have the greatest impact. Grant making, obviously it's something that most foundations do. I gave an example before of the one foundation and their loan loss reserve. The Foundation for Appalachian Kentucky in eastern Kentucky is just at the front end of creating a seed grant fund that will work alongside a loan fund in one of their that one of their economic development partners has, so that they can take some of the entrepreneurs that are not quite ready for a loan but could benefit from some startup capital. They're using their grant making in combination with this loan capital that a partner has. So again, a different way of thinking about grant making. And finally, investment. And this is a burgeoning area. We're just getting involved with a partner, Virginia Community Capital, that has an innovation award from the Community Development Financial Institutions Fund to begin to think about how to move impact investing forward and direct investing by foundations in Appalachia. But this whole movement around impact investing, making investments out of your corpus to achieve certain economic development or other outcomes is a growing interest among foundations. Fremont Area Foundation in Michigan has made a program-related investment into a Michigan-based CDFI that's going to be moving into their region to begin supporting business development and business lending. So again, you can see that there is a whole range of ways that foundations are engaging in economic development. It's happening everywhere, and it isn't just the big foundations. I mean, we see a lot of press around those larger foundations and what's happening in Silicon Valley and other places. But you'll see in the examples that we've given in the article that it's happening in lots of different foundations in large and small places. So let me just end quickly with just a sense of what we think it's going to take to move from this energy we see out there, some foundations really providing leadership here, to a broader movement. And we are committed. You can see from the footer on our slides there, the Aspen CSG team and the center team really are committed to advancing economic development philanthropy. We want to see more foundations, more place-rooted foundations practicing this with excellence. And So what do we think it's going to take to actually get this into a broader movement? One is just sharing what's working. We've done 2 events now, the pre-conference workshop at the Council on Foundation and another conference the year before that really was focused on this topic, and it was focused on foundations sharing what they're doing and how it's working to advance both family and community economic success. And powerful opportunities for foundations to learn from each other, and we've got to do more of that. A deeper understanding of economic development, I think there is a sense among many foundations that that's not our domain. We don't do it. I think economic development organizations also are very ready to say, foundations, that's not your domain. We'll take care of that. You worry about charitable giving. And so helping foundations see that there actually is a role for you to play, and that we're not talking about taking over from traditional economic development, but bringing a different set of perspectives and knowledge to the table to influence the way it gets done. Understanding the full range of tools. It's been more than 20 years now since the West Central Initiative got an IRS ruling that said they could do business lending, and many foundations still don't recognize that they have that tool in their toolkit. It's going to take culture change. It's going to take leadership, staff, economic development partners understanding that there is a role here, and foundation really using some of the skills that they already have, like resident engagement, convening across sectors to begin to have some of the dialogues that need to happen. Bridge building to traditional economic developers. I think this is a critically important one. We hear lots of stories of foundations. As soon as they begin to talk about economic development, they get a call from the chamber or from the local economic development person saying, what are you doing? This is what we do. And being able to have that broader system conversation and recognize that there are lots of pieces of this system and ways in which the foundation can play a role. Managing risks and expectations is critical. This is about social entrepreneurship, and things that a foundation tries may not work. And being willing to accept a little failure as you do this is critical. And that's not that's a new role for foundations, and one that I think we're going to have to do some work around. And the final thing is extending an invitation to national philanthropy. I've been around the rural philanthropy movement for a long time, and most often national philanthropy is we're asking them to come and do right by rural. This really is about place-rooted foundations inviting national philanthropy to partner with them to achieve the kinds of outcomes that they want to achieve. And so those are the things we see as building this broader movement, and I'm looking forward to feedback and questions from all of you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Deb. We do have a few questions for you, and some for both of you. Let me start with one for you, Deb. As you were just wrapping up, do you have any findings or any reflections on your experience about balancing playing a facilitative role in economic development, like trying to co-develop a strategy, versus more of a directive role, meaning ensuring that a strategy is well thought out? I think it's the tension in philanthropy being trying to help communities implement best practices versus being very responsive to community interests, community needs. And while those aren't really opposed, sometimes there is a balancing act between the two. So I'd be interested, actually, for both of you in your thoughts on that.
It's a really good question, Doug, and I'll try to be really brief, because I think unfortunately the answer is it probably depends upon the community. And again, just to reference Encourage Foundation, I think I think Kelly Ryan would say that they do have to take a bit more of a directive role, and to say there's some values and a perspective we bring here that are that we're just not going to compromise on. And they were doing that because of their deep engagement with the community, but it is challenging to the old leadership to sort of, mix both of pieces of your question there. But I think in other cases, I think where there is an openness on the part of the economic development infrastructure to see the foundation as a partner in this, the development of an economic development strategy that's actually going to be more inclusive and work for everybody, I think that playing to the assets of the foundation works pretty well. And I won't spend too much time because I want to give Laurel a chance, but I think it's a really critical piece of this, and I think the foundation is going to have to tread really lightly and understand who's at the table and how effective are they right now in economic development, and then what perspective they need to bring to that conversation.
Thanks. Laurel, did you want to comment on that?
Well, absolutely. So I thought Deb did a great job. I would agree that it kind of depends on the local context. One thing I would add, though, and I noticed there was a follow-up question about what about in particularly communities where there's not a history of civic engagement, or perhaps a history where there's a one voice dominating this conversation. And I would say that, in that balance and that treading lightly, a strong role that the Community Foundation can play is ensuring that there's a multitude of voices at the table. So whether taking a facilitative role or a directive role, helping spread that conversation, ensuring that it's not just one voice, whether it's industry or local government driving that, would be an important facilitative and directive role that the CF could play.
Okay, great. So one of the things I was curious about is the, I'm going to call it knowledge management practices. And that in some circles has a very specific meaning around databases and knowledge management. But I just want a little more general term. How do you think about, as a foundation, how do you actually manage this knowledge that is now becoming such an asset? Are there particular practices that you use, particular communication strategies, and just this? I think it's a kind of another big knot that many foundations try to untie.
That's a good question. Well, so Laurel here. I mean, from our experience, there's many different sizes and ways that this can be done, and I think it really kind of depends on the volume and scope of the knowledge that you're dealing with. I definitely leave time for Deb in a moment in the event that, Deb, you have specifics on the different management systems as an example. But one of the things that we've been starting to see emerge is also that that value and importance of open data, and the pivot, for example, that the Vancouver Foundation is leading in Canada towards Creative Commons licensing and open data on all of their granting, and having that as an important cornerstone of the work that they do. So it's not only, I think, a question about how do you manage that knowledge yourself, but how do you avail that knowledge to the community in an open way. Okay,
great. That's a great point. Deb, do you have anything you wanted to add about that?
I would say I agree with Laurel. I think the power that we've seen behind this is when the foundation, again, doesn't just have that knowledge themselves, but actually takes it out into community conversations. And I used that anecdote earlier, but I think it's important for folks in a community to be able to understand and reflect back on themselves and their own perceptions. And I think when the foundation manages the data, to use your term, Terry, by using it to start conversations in the community and to help people understand their community at a much deeper level than they may have access to right now, I think you're doing what Laurel described as turning that information into a knowledge asset. That's really, I think it's a critical role that foundations can play. That again, I think there's an awful lot of other entities that don't necessarily see themselves as taking things out and engaging the community around it.
Great. Yeah, as you were, both of you were speaking, you both really emphasized getting knowledge from all parts of a community, making sure that people whose knowledge maybe has not been surfaced and shared gets brought out. And it really strikes me as we're having really this national discussion about structural inequality right now, this concept of really using knowledge of community as a way to promote equity is really powerful. And when you think about ways that you change a system, Donella Meadows, who's one of the systems thinking gurus, talks about first making a system visible and then connecting it more closely to itself as two powerful ways to change a system. And it really kind of strikes me that really that's what you're talking about in some ways, is making the bringing knowledge about all parts of the system forward so that everybody can see them. I don't know if you had any comment on that, but it was more comment than a question.
I think this is Deb. I think you're spot on, Terry. I think that's the unique role, I think, particularly in terms of economic development that a foundation plays, because the foundation that may be, have a focus on families, have a focus on children, as well as economic development, can begin to paint a much bigger picture of what economic development looks like. And we know that the education system is tied into that, and the social service system, and quality of life investments. I mean, it's a much richer picture of what drives an economy and makes it successful for everybody. And if the foundation can actually paint that bigger, as you said, make that system apparent, then they can also begin to say, if we're creating jobs over here and we're not building the skills of the people who live here to take those jobs, something's wrong. There's a disconnect here. And I just see foundations as being in that space of revealing the system, as you said.
Great. Thanks. So a couple of other maybe more specific questions. Deb, what do you think is keeping foundations from taking more leadership on economic development? You've talked about trying to maybe start a movement around this. What do you see as some of the barriers? And Laurel, I'd be really curious in hearing your thoughts on how that plays out in the Canadian context.
I really think the biggest barrier, just so I don't give a litany here, the biggest barrier is just recognizing that they have a role to play. Having the vision to see that it's possible for them to actually step into this space. And it's why I think the peer exchange and lifting up the foundations that are actively working in economic development and the range of ways they're doing it is so critical to building this movement, because part of it is just getting over we don't do that, that's not our role, and seeing that it is a role and it's a way to get to the real kinds of outcomes that foundations want, which are solutions to the things that are holding the community back, which are often tied to the economic opportunities that exist there. So I think being able to sort of create this broader vision that this is a role for philanthropy and to give foundations the tools they need to be able to better drill down and define that role.
Great. Laurel, any thoughts about how that plays out in Canada?
Well, I mean, a couple of reflections of what that I was observing myself as I was reading your article, Deb, and there was just this real reflection on something you pointed out earlier, which is just that economic development is often defined in fairly narrow terms. And so I think that one big hurdle is, and perhaps this ties into what you're talking about in terms of a needed culture and perspective shift, but as long as economic development is perceived in this narrow lens of economic growth and jobs, I think it often is difficult for foundations to see themselves tied in specifically with that. So there is like a language challenge almost. But in Canada, there's also been some regulatory changes in the last couple of years, and I think that, interestingly, that's created some confusion around the regulations that govern things like impact investment, the extent to which foundations and other organizations can engage in that. We've had a shift of government about a year ago, and there was a significant change in the treatment of the government towards the charitable sector at that time, and so there just continues to be some remaining questions around this, and I think what we're seeing as a fallout is the ongoing concern from foundations and other charitable organizations about being involved in things like economic development and advocacy, and some concern about, are we playing within the rules, what are the rules? And so that's almost even a testament to that important piece around knowledge as an asset and having knowledge and the correct information to make decisions as an organization.
That's great. I just wanted to this is more of a comment, but I noticed the use of the term place-rooted, and we've had a lot of the jargon in the sector has been around place-based for the last several years, and I think the place-rooted creates a much different image than the place-rooted versus place-based. They're very different images. Wondered about that. I'm sure that there was a great deal of intentionality around that shift in language, and just wanted to note that. Okay, I'd like to turn it over to Jesse Salazar from the Council of Foundations to make a few closing comments. Jesse is the Vice President of Content Design for the Council and has been our supporter and our colleague on this issue of the journal and presenting this webinar. So Jesse, I'd like to turn it over to you for a few comments.
Absolutely. Thank you, Terry. And thank you to Laurel and Deborah for your really thoughtful presentations. I know the Council is going to be doing more work with Community Foundations of Canada as we've done for the last few years. And I hope some of you will consider coming to our pre-conference at our annual meeting in Dallas that's going to be focused on rural development. I know Deborah played an integral role in that last time. I'm just going to be brief, and that's to say that this special issue comes out of an ongoing effort by the Council to take its content and the programming that it creates and give it legs, to make sure that we are treating these discussions about the future of the field not just as moments in time, but part of a larger conversation, and trying to figure out how we can keep important conversations going and explore ideas in a variety of ways. So, we feel very happy about the kind of quality that came in this special issue, and we were particularly thrilled that so many people from across the field had taken such an interest in the subject of the future of the community. I think Terry received more than 90 submissions, which is over 3 times what they normally get. And for us, that's a really strong symbol of the importance of this topic. We hear about it pretty much every day from different community foundations trying to deal with different community problems. And so I just want to thank the foundation review team, all the peer reviewers who participated, and of course, all the great people that contributed, like Laurel and Deborah.
Okay, thank you, Jesse. It was a great partnership. We very much appreciate it. So I want to just conclude with giving you some contact information. Again, everybody will get the slides and a link to the recording, but Deb and Laurel's emails are on the screen there if you'd like to follow up with them about anything in particular in the meantime. When this ends, you're going to get a link to an evaluation, and we take our evaluations very seriously. Would very much appreciate your taking just maybe a minute to complete the evaluation at the end. So again, thank you to everyone. For more information about the Foundation Review, you can find our website there. This issue is, again, open access thanks to the sponsorship of the Council on Foundations. So you can see all of the articles by going to foundationreview.org. If you are not currently a subscriber, you can apply the webinar fee that you paid for this webinar to a new subscription. You can contact Pat Manzer at the email there. And then finally, in recognition of our partnership, we're going to offer COF members who are participating in this webinar who are not current subscribers a 20% off a new subscription. Just use the promo code on your screen there, COF16, and you'll be given the 20% off on a new subscription. And the web addresses are subscribefoundationreview.org. Okay, well that concludes our webinar. You will see the evaluation form pop up as we are closing out, and thank you very much. Deb, Laurel, great presentations, very much appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.